At this point, I think it's safe to say that most of the people watching this video have used or heard of macOS, Windows, and some mainline Linux distros like Ubuntu. But what about the other options of operating systems? Well, I've searched the bowels of the internet for some other options, and I'm gonna try them out. And then I will be ranking them on a tier list because that seemed fun. But I've got a different tier list in mind because I think the standard one is boring and ugly. So I've designed my own. The categories on our new non-boring tier list are actually cool, frustrating, why, what the fuck, and straight to bitch prison. And one thing to keep in mind, straight to bitch prison is the highest honor that you can get in this tier list, because bitch prison is fun. I would know. Oh, and by the way, while we're introducing things, welcome to the new Diskette Studio. I've lived here for 3 months and just haven't made a video yet, so let me know if you want a tour at some point. I've got some cool new stuff in here that is different from previous, and I just think it looks cooler. But with all that out of the way, let's get into some operating systems. The first alternative operating system I installed was Haiku, which is an open source revival of the long defunct BOS. Speaking of alternative operating systems, by the way, BOS, made by B Inc., first in 1995, was a completely standalone from macOS, Windows, or Linux operating system, mostly made for the B-Box computer, with a focus on multimedia and speed. So it had a lot of things that macOS and Windows didn't have at the time, but lacked things like software support, which made it less attractive for some people. BOS is just generally pretty interesting, and I'd love to install it on my iMac G5 because it was actually made for PowerPC for its early days. Unfortunately though, it only survived until 2000, but it's been kept alive ever since then with the open source Haiku project, which has carried over basically all of its features, its interface into a free open source version for everyone that also runs on all platforms, not just PowerPC 32. But what's especially cool is that it's very much in active development. Its latest version was released this February, so it's not even a dead project and is getting updated all the time. I first want to complain about Broadcom VMware's grade A bullshit, because I never really liked VirtualBox 7, so I switched over to VMware. This was fine until Broadcom purchased them about a year ago. The problem that this caused for me is that I can no longer access my license, and they hide your download to VMware of any edition, even the ones that are free, behind a Broadcom Customer Connect account. This is fine. I had a VMware Customer Connect account, which housed my license key and offered a download to Fusion Player and Workstation Player, both of which were free at the time. Well, fast forward to today, when I needed to install VMware Workstation Player on this computer. I thought it would be fine. I went and logged into my migrated Broadcom Customer Connect account and tried to download VMware. It told me that I could not download VMware and to try again later because there were additional verification steps of some kind. I ended up searching Reddit, finding that a bunch of people were having this issue, but a kind-hearted soul did offer a download link to all the versions of Workstation and Fusion Player. But then once I did get things installed, come to find out, you don't even need a license key anymore to use VMware Workstation Player or even VMware Workstation Pro anymore for free. Why are you hiding it behind a licensing system then, Broadcom? What is this achieving? Do you want less people to use your software that you're giving away already? Once I did get it installed, we now have VMware Workstation Pro instead. So that's nice, I guess, but their UI is pretty awful. I have this computer in dark mode, and they didn't make a white version of the logo. So the 17 is purple, but the rest of the text is just black. And so if I had a light theme, it would show up fine. But because I'm using dark mode, it's almost invisible. I'm really not sure what Broadcom is doing and why they're ruining products like this, but whatever. On to Haiku. Starting up, I was greeted by a basic but interesting enough boot screen, and just put right into the installer. Even just here, I was impressed by the sheer speed. No other operating system I've ever used will go to the installer this fast. From here, I opted to just try it live, but once again was immediately just there, without a single loading screen or reboot. The desktop is pretty standard, with options like the web browser and access to a file manager, but on the side here is the desk bar, which is taken directly from BOS rather than being a recreation like most other parts. The desk bar is one of two components that B just open sourced right before the Palm acquisition, while keeping the rest of BOS closed source. Since I referenced the web browser, WebPositive, a reference to NetPositive from BOS, I also tried to open my website on it. And it kind of worked. The navbar did mostly work, although it turned the links that were supposed to be there into a hamburger menu, and it seemed like a lot of the CSS that's present doesn't really work properly. I'm not sure if this is down to Nuxt not understanding what WebPositive is, or it just missing a bunch of modern CSS properties, but the YouTube API did seem to mostly work. I did also try clicking on my Blue Sky link in the navbar, and it did mostly work, but the margins were kind of strange. So I'm not actually sure if this is the browser's fault, or if Blue Sky is also just using some slightly strange CSS. I also explored some of the other apps included as demos, such as WebGL Teapot, a text editor, and some of the amazing screensavers available. Unfortunately, after I tried this first seizure-inducing one, the screensaver preferences crashed and would not open again. And I also really love that the dialogues option is, oh yeah, instead of just okay. This took me directly to the built-in Haiku debugger, which really looks like macOS console. It allows you to save logs and just view what's happening on your system live. Along with that, Haiku has the option to add custom keyboard shortcuts built in as an applet. I also really love that this is in such a simple interface and it's not buried behind a bunch of other settings. Unfortunately, most of the other graphics-based things seem to have broken after the screensaver problem. And I did try rebooting my system, but it didn't work. So I'm just going to chalk it up to Haiku not understanding VMware's very generic fake hardware. I was never really sure what Playground was, although it seems interesting, and I like the theme of this system monitor. It's nice and simple, but elegant at the same time. Trying out Haiku finally was really cool, just because it gives me hope for the open source community. Just the ability to revive what would otherwise be a completely dead product, I feel like really speaks to the fundamentals of the open source community. And the fact that BOS was so unique in the first place and Haiku is building off that uniqueness is really cool. So I'm putting it in actually cool. Next, let's go on to another fully independent operating system called ToaruOS. It's maintained by a single person and has been going for about 10 years now. And while it's certainly not meant to be a daily driver of any kind, I once again think it's a cool example of open source stuff, and it's been the model of other Unix-like independent operating systems for a bunch of people, which is really neat. Straight off, I was greeted by this lovely welcome panel. It guides you through the basic operations and function of things on the desktop with the spotlight effect. And once again, we were right there without any extra loading screens, so this does really lend credence to the simpler the better when it comes to software. There were also some built-in graphics demos just like Haiku, but this time they actually worked. It's always fun to play around with fractals, so this was neat to look at. There was also an included text editor and other basic programs, but unfortunately no web browser, so I wasn't able to test anything there. I did try to see if I could install some packages, but none were available, so either there aren't any or whatever database used to store and fetch them from isn't currently operational. Also, a quick side note, the ToaruOS website is really neat because the developer has made it look exactly like ToaruOS by itself, with working windows and navigation. It's just a really nice touch and also gives you a nice sneak peek into the interface, which I feel is often lacking of the websites of other OSs and especially smaller Linux distros. Toaru is once again another cool example of open source things. While it doesn't have a community around it in the same way because it is maintained by a single person, it still has the open source spirit. I also really love how Toaru's interface ends up looking cool and unique and not just looking like an XFCE or Mate clone while avoiding the retro or outdated design look. But now let's take a break from interesting and cool to hellish. And when I say hellish, I mean literally hellish, because next up is Ubuntu Satanic Edition, specifically version 666.11, which is based off of Ubuntu 11.10 and released in 2012. Upon just starting up Ubuntu Satanic Edition, I already knew I was in for a treat. Just this boot screen seemed like something good was ahead. I then spent way too long trying to fix my screen resolution because I forgot how GNOME 2 worked. After installing, I realized I was stupid and had to do all of that again anyway. But I did get to see this other wonderful boot screen. I think my favorite part about Ubuntu Satanic Edition, and where most of the customization goes into, are the wallpapers. Because while they left all the standard Ubuntu ones intact, there's also at least 20 additional Satanic options. But while I was looking through those, it seems to have connected to the internet because I was given the option to upgrade straight to Ubuntu 14.04. While I was curious about what would happen if I let it do this, I decided to put it on the back burner for now until I'd gotten to check more things out just in case it messed everything up. Basically all the apps are stock, and I think all the icons are as well, other than this shortcut on the desktop which opens up a broken media player window. I let it sit for a while, but it just wouldn't do anything. The main thing I was worried about with doing this is that in the period between Ubuntu 11.10 and 14.04, they switched desktop environments from GNOME 2 to Canonical's own Unity. So I was pretty unsure if this change in entire desktop environments plus upgrading about 5 versions in one go would completely break all these customizations. I just let it do its thing, which was relatively speedy, only complaining a couple of times and taking about 15 minutes. Once I rebooted, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that everything seemed to be fine. The dark theme was still partially there, my wallpaper stayed the same, and the media player window was even functional now. I'm guessing that the Metalcast was some sort of podcast, but I can't find any information about it online other than metal casting. Unfortunately, due to the way that my screen capture works, I also don't have audio from this, so I can't even play you any of the Metalcast. Come on, Blackmagic, I just wanted to listen to the Metalcast. The newer version of Firefox included in 14.04 was also more usable, and while things like the YouTube API and my little social icons in the navbar didn't really work, the majority of CSS properties other than variable weighted fonts were basically functional. I was also still able to log into the GNOME shell, although it was GNOME 3, so it didn't keep any of the general layout or look of the previous upgrade, but it looked a little bit more similar than the Unity version. Ubuntu Satanic Edition is obviously not a serious operating system. It was probably made while high or in denial of the church. Either way, sounds fun. But it's kind of strangely customized in some areas and not in others. So I'm giving it the what the fuck rating because that just feels like it fits it the most. It's too good for bitch prison. I think that for now at least, that's as much hell that I can take, so let's take a break for something very near and dear to my heart, because next up, it's good old FreeBSD. Yes, I am a FreeBSD girly through and through, so this was pretty exciting to revisit. And in fact, FreeBSD was one of the earliest non-macOS or Windows operating systems I ever tried out, before I even started doing things with Linux. So it was pretty fun to revisit some of my experiences from about 5 years ago now when I was really first getting into all this nerd shit. I've always loved ASCII versions of logos on boot screens, so just the boot screen was fun. But from there, I proceeded to the installer, which finished pretty fast. By default, FreeBSD doesn't include a desktop environment of any kind because it's not really meant to be used as a desktop OS. But there are versions of the most popular Linux desktops available, so I decided to install GNOME because that's what I'd pick if I were installing a Linux distro. Even with the guide from the FreeBSD project about installing desktop environments, this took far longer than I'd like to admit to actually get working. But once I did get it working and rebooted the computer, there we were, on by far the most stock installation of GNOME I've ever seen. Not even a wallpaper, we just have a blue background. What is this, Windows 95? To put it into perspective, you get more than this when you install Vanilla GNOME on Arch from scratch. As was the custom at this point, now that we had a browser, I had to test it out. And it worked flawlessly, which isn't really a surprise when GNOME Web is essentially the Linux version of Safari because it's just a GTK port of WebKit. I was able to get a wallpaper, I enabled maximize and minimize in the title bars, and played a good round of Worms. Definitely not the intended use for FreeBSD, but I did have a time. Not necessarily a good time, but a time. Well, as I mentioned, FreeBSD will always have a special place in my heart. It is, unfortunately, frustrating. I think that its documentation, while extremely extensive, can be sometimes too extensive and a little bit dense to actually comprehend. A lot of it is almost entirely predicated on you having some kind of prior knowledge, which is fine, but it does make it frustrating. But also, to be completely fair, it is not meant to be a desktop operating system. It's not meant to be used by most people. It's a great backend for a lot of things. Hell, macOS is built off of FreeBSD in some areas. But it is not an operating system you are meant to use as an average person on your average computer. Now that I'm done having a, I guess you could call, good time reliving my past, let's go straight back to the bottom of the barrel with Hannah Montana Linux. Yeah, I wish this wasn't real, but here we are with Ubuntu 904. I'm not really sure what else to say about Hannah Montana Linux, so I think I'll just let it speak for itself with its unique aspects. Booting the live version of Hannah Montana Linux, I wasn't exactly expecting the color scheme to be identical to the logo. Imagine if I did this with my logo. In fact, if I ever do, just take me out. I also just feel bad for Tux in this default wallpaper because he doesn't deserve to get dragged into this shit show. Come on, leave Tux alone. What did he do to you? I did decide to go ahead and install it to my disk, which finished pretty quickly. While all the applications seem to just be from stock Ubuntu, they are all properly skinned to go with whatever you'd call this color scheme. But thanks to these pre-installed productivity apps, I made a contact for Hannah herself. I think in fact that I'll ditch Jira and start just using Hannah Montana Linux in a VM to manage everything related to video production. Because why would you use a Kanban board when you have hot pink and slime green? I think whoever made Hannah Montana Linux must have been high, and whatever they were on, I want some because it sounds fucking fun. The thing that I'm specifically impressed with is just the level of customization. While it's basically all default apps, every icon is customized to a T, everything is pink and purple. And it's pretty clear that quite a bit of work went into it. So that's why I am bestowing the great honor of bitch prison onto it, because it is awful and hellacious, but in a fun way. But if you thought that Hannah Montana Linux was kind of a strange premise to brand yourself with, you haven't heard of UwUntu. UwUntu describes itself as the best UwUOS, which is not personally something I would brand myself with, but to each their own, I guess. The boot screen for UwUntu really reminded me of an off-centered version of the current MediaWiki logo. I went ahead and installed Ubuntu while it told me about all of the features it includes. As far as I can tell though, the main addition is just the Budgie desktop environment, but it's different from the standard official Ubuntu Budgie flavor, and is basically just normal Budgie but on top of Ubuntu, rather than the modified version of Budgie that ships with Ubuntu Budgie. I saw that Discord, Spotify, and Steam come pre-installed, but other than that, this is pretty much it. It's kind of just a Budgie desktop environment with a funny wallpaper that hasn't been updated in 4 years. To be honest, I wasn't that impressed with Ubuntu's customization. While this is completely my opinion, I'm not generally a fan of Budgie. I just think it does some kind of strange things, and I'm kind of not sure why they switched over it instead of just keeping GNOME. I suppose that Budgie is kind of the most weeaboo adjacent of any desktop environment that I can think of, but it just doesn't feel very polished. I wish there was more customization to it to make it feel unique. And so that's why I'm giving it the Y ranking, because I think that it could be kind of funny and cool if there had been more added to it. I think it's trying to be Hannah Montana Linux without some of the amazing customization that makes Hannah Montana Linux Hannah Montana Linux. But also, they went to the work of making a whole Ubuntu flavor and registering a domain and making a website for it, and then didn't actually do that much. I think it's absolutely a funny thing to joke about, but it's kind of not as interesting as I was hoping it was going to be. After just the sheer amount of operating systems I had all installed back to back over the course of a few hours, I was kind of done, especially with Hannah Montana Linux and Ubuntu back to back. I just couldn't take it anymore. So after I got back from dinner, I was excited to try something else out that I knew was going to be interesting. Which takes us to ReactOS, which is once again a pretty cool premise for an operating system because it basically seeks to reproduce the whole Windows NT experience and make an alternative operating system that's completely independent, completely compatible with Windows apps. It does have a little bit of a relationship with the Wine project, but it is otherwise basically its own thing. And it's been in alpha for 27 years. And it kind of shows. It very much still looks like Windows XP, but it's once again a testament of open source software standing the test of time and still being maintained. Booting into the ReactOS installer, I was immediately struck by how exactly identical to the first stage of Windows XP setup it was. From the layout of the text to the options it presented, it really was exactly the same. Even once we got to the graphical stage, it looked very similar to Windows XP, just with the classic theme applied. And I've seen plenty of recreations of the interface of basically any versions of Windows. I've never seen it go this far and be this accurate. It is on point, but even the more modern themes still just look like Windows XP. I also really love some of these Bliss-inspired wallpapers. I actually really wish they were higher resolution because they would instantly be the wallpapers on my two main monitors or maybe even the iMac pair. I also did find it kind of interesting that the modern skin essentially just looks like Windows 8.1 with OpenShell, which for several years was actually my favorite Windows configuration. And while it's mostly just the title bars that look the same, the ultra-flat style is really interesting for a continuously developed 27-year-old OS. It's always fun to go play some old Windows games, so I was excited to see the classics like Minesweeper and Solitaire. Although I didn't particularly care for the strange flat version of the spider skin. While ReactOS is meant to have full Windows NT compatibility, most apps still don't actually work. So I decided to not bother with that, given that it would have been complicated just to download a file with the lack of a web browser. I probably could have used a disk image and inserted it into the virtual disk drive, but when there's so few programs to choose from, and most of them are just other open source programs like GIMP, it just didn't feel worth the bother. After just rounds and rounds of horrors, it was really nice to get back to something interesting again, because this is just another great example of cool open source stuff. I think that it's trying a bit too hard to look like Windows XP and not necessarily in a fun way, and could probably use a different UI refresh because its modern versions of the UI, it is just really impressive also to have a project last for over 27 years with active development and still not be finished. But the dedication shown by the people maintaining it is so cool. So keep going, ReactOS developers, you are actually cool. Now, for our penultimate operating system, let's look at Lindows, or I guess Lindows OS. It seems to have different names in different places, and while they call themselves Lindows.com, things like the splash screen shows up as Lindows OS. This is another example of Linux in the early 2000s attempting to try and get some people to switch over from Windows. And by integrating basically more wine stuff, they were trying to get you to be able to run all your standard Windows apps, but within Linux. Lindows has a pretty interesting history of battles with Microsoft and a rebrand and changing hands several times, free versions with other strangeness, and their pretty hilarious ad campaigns. So, where's the showcase of Lindows? Well, great question. There isn't one. I tried many things to get Lindows installed on a virtual machine. I tried an older version of Lindows. I was using 4.0, I tried 3.0. I even tried emulating an even older CPU architecture with QEMU, all to no avail. I just could not get Lindows to install and kept getting stuck on this error screen. While I would have loved to try it out, and I think it has some really interesting history, and as I mentioned, it could honestly be a whole video by itself with just the history around it, but do let me know if you'd be interested in a whole Lindows video, because like I said, it's pretty interesting, just the whole thing around it, what it was trying to accomplish, and its rebrands over the years, but unfortunately I was not able to try it today. Thanks so much for watching to the end of this OS testing journey. All of these rankings are really just my opinions, but I hope you found them interesting enough, and well, you're still here, I guess, so that's good. If you think there's another OS that I should have tried and didn't include here, then let me know down in the comments, and just generally if you want to see other projects. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Blue Sky if you want fun behind the scenes and updates, and with that, you will see me in the next video. I already forgot what I was talking about, and the camera's out of focus. Woohoo! It's because this is ToaruOS. What? Oh no, I forgot how to pronounce this.
One, which means some in Japanese. Let's say it all together.
Editing Ren is, fucked. Nothing like drinking tea and eating barbecue potato chips while working on a video that you should have finished 2 weeks ago. I should stop eating chips. I'm ruining my voice with the chip crumbs. I also found that there were shit, I had to say that on camera again. Why am I doing this to myself? So I decided to install GNOME because that's what I would install if I were installing. So I decided